This past weekend at UFC 329, Paddy Pimblett would make his first appearance back in the octagon after his first championship fight back in January against Justin Gaethje. And although he would fall short in that one, we got to witness an absolute bounce-back masterclass from Paddy this past Saturday, submitting Benoit Saint-Denis in under 1 minute, which was even crazier considering Vegas had Paddy as the underdog heading into this fight. And I know I'm not Vegas, but having Paddy as an underdog was insanely disrespectful and criminal. I know BSD had a resurgence in his career after getting 3 straight finishes against guys like Rufi, Dan Hooker, and Beneil Dariush. And these wins were pretty impressive at the time considering BSD was just kind of written off at that point in his career, coming off a bad loss to Dustin Poirier. But I still didn't see any world where it logically made sense that BSD was a favorite over Paddy Pimblett, even with Paddy coming off a loss. And that loss wasn't even that bad against Justin Gaethje. It actually aged pretty well. But either way, Paddy proved me right and made it look extremely easy this weekend. And naturally, Paddy did some speaking on the mic after his win. And when it came to mention who he would call out next, he did not hesitate nor stutter to speak the name Ilia Topuria, which actually wasn't the first time he's mentioned him. You see, these two go way back. 5 years ago, Paddy was trash talking a Georgian fighter online who happened to be a friend of Ilia Topuria. Paddy called this dude a fake Russian, and considering Ilia is also from Georgia, he didn't like that too much. A few more Georgian fighters would tweet at Paddy until Paddy would go even further, saying, "No wonder why the Russians terrorized you," which coincides with the Russo-Georgian War of 2008. Ilia and his fellow Georgians were rightfully upset about Paddy joking about a war, but the crazy thing is, Paddy actually had no clue about that war. The following year, Ilia would run into Paddy face-to-face after the two would compete on UFC Fight Night, Volkov vs. Aspinall. And although Paddy had apologized about his comments, Topuria was standing on business as he confronted Paddy in the hotel lobby, going as far as throwing a hand sanitizer bottle at Paddy. And this was how Ilia garnered the nickname Hand Sanitizer Boy from Paddy, who has called him that numerous times. Ilia was obviously not a fan of Paddy's remarks towards his country's recent conflict, which resulted in many lost lives. And the beef would only continue. Later that year, the two would yet again compete on the same card, this time a pay-per-view, UFC 282. This confrontation would be a lot more public considering it would happen at a literal press conference. Ilia would have to be held back by security while Paddy would just cook up his usual comments, probably calling Ilia like a sausage or something. All of the meanwhile, Ilia Topuria would go on to have an undefeated generational run at featherweight, claiming that division's title and even moving up to Paddy's division to fight Charles Oliveira for the vacant lightweight title. In classic Ilia Topuria fashion, he would absolutely dominate, resulting in him becoming a 2-weight class world champ, while at this point, Paddy's best win was freaking Michael Chandler a few months prior, which was nothing crazy at the time and probably would be Ilia Topuria's 4th or 5th best win. But the best part was after Ilia's fight. Joe Rogan would summon Paddy Pimblett into the octagon and the two would actually face off. There was a lot of uncertainty about who Ilia Topuria's next opponent would be and who would be his first title defense at his new weight. And although it would have been a bit of a reach to give Paddy a title shot at this point, the UFC knew it would be a massive fight. Fast forward to January 2026, the UFC decided it was best to have an interim lightweight title fight because Ilia Topuria was inactive for some time dealing with some personal issues.
I met my wife in Miami.
Damn. Who says you can't meet your wife in Miami?
Why are you saying that?
Huh?
Justin Gaethje was the first name brought up, and although Arman was ranked number 1 in the division, they would give the interim title shot to Paddy freaking Pimblett. And although, like I said, he would go through a 5-round war with Gaethje, he would still lose by decision. However, many found it very impressive that Paddy hung in there with Gaethje and how he didn't get knocked out like he said Scoutsers don't do. So it happened to be a moral victory for Paddy despite the loss. And somehow that loss would age wonderfully for Paddy Pimblett because a few months later, Gaethje would KO Ilia Topuria in one of the craziest upsets the sport has ever seen at UFC Freedom 250. And with Ilia's loss dropping him to number 1 and more than likely not getting an immediate rematch, he would need a bounce back fight before getting another title shot. But what fight would make sense for Ilia? Charles and Max both would make 0 sense considering they just got knocked out by Ilia. Arman would make sense, but he's more than likely getting a title shot or rematching Charles. And that would leave BSD as the next highest ranked fighter until this past weekend 2nd, where Paddy absolutely obliterated him, which would now make Paddy Pimblett the next highest rank. So it's clear the UFC needs to book this fight sometime in the near future. Paddy took 0 damage whatsoever in his recent fight, and although Ilia did take a lot of damage in his last fight, he is recovering fairly quickly. Bro is literally a superhero at this point. And both fighters have expressed their excitement for this fight. There would be no belt on the line, but I still think with how marketable this fight could be, they really don't need a belt. It could definitely be a main event of a numbered event. And although we've seen some sick rivalries in the past, it's been a while since we've had a proper fight where the two sides truly hate each other. Sure, we had Hamza versus Strickland back in May, but that kind of just ended up being fabricated beef. And I know after two humans fight each other, they tend to respect each other a little bit more, so that might have been the cause of that. But I don't know if Ilia and Paddy could ever be friends, bro. There's nothing fabricated about their beef. This lore has been cooking for 5 years in the making. And with these two possessing some of the best mic skills the UFC has ever seen, the build-up for this fight would be legendary. Filled with hilarious and entertaining trash talk, there would definitely be iconic moments in the build-up to this fight alone. And not to mention, if Dana does a world tour for this fight, which would seem unlikely, but it would be absolutely sick to see them do a press conference in Spain, maybe London, and Ilia Topuria has his Conor McGregor Rio de Janeiro press conference moment. And not to mention the actual fight when these two get in the octagon. I'm pretty sure Ilia Topuria is still a massive favorite based on the betting odds, but you cannot count out Paddy. Two of the best walkouts in the UFC as well. It would be absolute cinema. And not to mention, you got Paddy Pimblett at his absolute highest with Ilia Topuria at his absolute lowest. I think I'm still leaning towards Ilia Topuria to get it done. I'm not writing him off just because he had one loss to Justin Gaethje. I think he heavily underestimated Justin Gaethje and thought he could just walk through him like anybody else. So I think he'll learn and he'll adjust and he'll come back even better, which is so scary to think about. But then again, he is one of my favorite fighters, so maybe I'm just biased and I'm just wishful thinking. However, all biases aside, Ilia Topuria versus Paddy Pimblett needs to happen. That is the biggest fight the UFC could make right now.